This video was inspired by a comment. If you would like to suggest a video, I will probably do it. If you ever find yourself in an introductory creative writing workshop for the first time, there are a few things that will hit you immediately. The first is that, like all skills and knowledge, creative writing has a Dunning-Kruger effect, and everyone in the room is right about here. The second is that the underlying mechanics of writing form a fickle beast, and you will spend your entire first and possibly even second go at it, unlearning all of the lies you didn't even know you were told about fiction as a whole. We've all been there. You'll survive as long as you're willing to actually learn the mechanics. I say all of that because dialogue and character interactions are usually the final things that trip new writers. Usually, writers first begin to understand plot, which then improves dialogue because characters can finally stop talking the plot. Because the dialogue did improve, it will suddenly go under the radar again because the writer will think they've already figured that out and can move on. Then new writers will notice their characters falling short of what the plot requires of them and start to develop those better as well. That also results in the dialogue improving, so once again, it's not usually looked at directly. Dialogue isn't usually directly noticed until everything else in a given story has already been developed quite nicely, and yet it still reads roughly. Yet, even when dialogue is tightened, it can still feel stiff or off if the interactions around the dialogue are not also worked on. My goal today is to simply jumpstart you enough that when you find yourself at that stage, you already know how to work yourself through it. The first thing you need to remember is something I've mentioned before, which are the 3 missions of every scene because they also apply to dialogue as well. Ideally, it will always do all 3. At minimum, it must do 2. Dialogue that does 1 or none should be cut or merged into other dialogue. There are 2 reasons behind this. The first is that the reader or audience trusts that you are not going to waste the time they are investing into you, and the second is to reduce clutter, bloat, filler, whatever you want to call it. It's the stuff in the story that isn't doing anything but increasing the word count and holding the rest of the story back. Dialogue is by no means the only part of writing that will do that, but it is the one most newer writers will fall into. In fact, someone who never practices strong dialogue will struggle to publish anything in literary journals, which more often than not employ very strict word limits. Considering that literary journals are the best place to get your writing career started, let's just say you want to be able to tell the best story possible in the fewest words possible. So, where does someone start with all of that? Well, the first part is to cut the dialogue that is genuinely doing nothing. In my original character development video, I pointed out pleasantries as the biggest offender. Having characters give long-winded greetings to one another that only exist because greeting people is what we do in real life is the fastest way for your editor to start scribbling out entire blocks on pages. It is much better to have simpler acknowledgements. For example, if 2 characters are familiar with one another already, just have them hug, kiss, secret handshake, something like that. If it's a formal business-like meeting, you try a handshake, a bow, or something along those lines. More story, less words. It keeps the editors happy, the publishers interested, and the readers invested. The next thing to look for is dialogue that only exists to catch the reader up to speed with something the characters already know about. Try your best to avoid situations where you have 2 or more characters reminiscing with one another just for the sake of reminiscing. If you must have a similar scene, then try out the alternative methods. One is to just make sure the main character doesn't know the information being shared, so they can at least process it in real time. Even better is to make whatever is being shared related to the plot at hand. For example, if the characters have done something similar before, you can write that backstory under the context that the characters will be doing it again, so they naturally want to talk about it. Subtext being present or missing is the litmus test to follow. In fact, subtext is so important that I made an entire video talking about it, and I recommend you watch it. But in summary, the text is what's on the page or on the screen, and the subtext is what the story is actually saying underneath. Whether or not a reader feels like the story works is almost always down to how effective the subtext is. If there is no subtext, there is no story. Robert McKee, whose book Story is something I will recommend over and over, explains it like this. If you write a beat in which a character steps up to a door, knocks, and waits, and in reaction the door is politely opened to invite him in, and the director is foolish enough to shoot this, in all probability it will never see the light of the screen. Any editor worthy of the title would instantly scrap it, explaining that these are 8 dead seconds. While that quote is focused on screenwriting, the same thing is true of narrative forms as well. If the scene has no deeper meaning than those specific words on a page, such as "good morning" being used as a filler greeting, then it does not serve the story and simply wastes time. If you're just setting up to a scene where there is actual subtext and tension, then just go to it. Your reader audience will be intelligent enough to know if a character is inside of a room, they probably entered it, so only show them entering if there is an important thing that happens that the reader audience would need to know, such as a character lying or other kind of clue. All of that relates closely to exposition, so let's talk about it for a bit. I know you've heard the phrase "show don't tell" a billion times from every single person who has ever talked about writing ever, but it's only because one group of people violate it every time they start writing, and a different group of people don't seem to understand what it actually means. In this sense, telling is when information is directly explained to the reader or audience in a very ham-fisted way. In narration, it feels like the author is lecturing the reader. In dialogue, it feels like the character has become a puppet. For example, Mark Hamill tells the story of a line of dialogue George Lucas wrote that Mark had to beg for it to be removed.
Dialogue was a little bit difficult. I remember there was one line that I just begged him to take out of the screenplay, and he finally did.
And it's when, the line?
Yes, boy, I'll never forget it as long as I live. I sometimes dream about this line. It was just coming upon the exploded planet of the princess,
Right.
Alderaan, and it's
Alderaan.
totally been blown away. And Harrison says, "Look, kid, I've done my part of the bargain. When I get to an asteroid, you, the old man, and the droids get dropped off." And my line was, "But we can't turn back. Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Aquilai or Soas, and what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault." And I thought, who talks like this, George? I mean, this is really not fair because, you know, we're the ones that are going to get vegetables thrown at us, not you.
Screenwriting is the easiest to understand for this because you can quite literally just show something on camera instead of a character mentioning it in dialogue. On the written page, some writers are confused because even narration is technically just words still. But it still comes back to efficiency. If there's something you are tempted to explain in the story, the best thing to do is to just let it happen. Don't explain it and then have it happen, because essentially you're doing it twice. And if it's something you want to explain but isn't actually important, then the likely right answer is to not explain it at all. The obvious objection someone might raise is that, if you follow the previously mentioned rules, then it doesn't seem like real conversation. After all, real people regurgitate the same information over and over again for hours at a time. We do follow long scripts of polite or professional conversation in public, and most of it does nothing for any real-life equivalent for these 3 missions. And you'd be right, but characters are not real people living in the real world. As far as storytelling goes, daily real life sucks. I'm not the one who's developed these rules either. Robert McKee says, eavesdrop on any coffee shop conversation and you'll realize in a heartbeat that you would never put that slush on screen. Real conversation is full of awkward pauses, poor word choices and phrasing, non sequiturs, pointless repetitions. It seldom makes a point or achieves closure. Blake Snyder, in his straightforwardness, explains that engaging characters talk differently than you and I. They have a way of saying things, even the most mundane things, which raise them above the norm. A character's dialogue is your opportunity to reveal character and tell us who this person is as much as what he is saying. How someone talks is character and can highlight all manner of that character's past, inner demons, and outlook on life. By making sure your dialogue is written so that it follows the 3 missions as closely as possible, you will find that your story will become far more engaging than anything written with dialogue that goes on and on without really saying anything. Stories are only read when they are interesting, they are only interesting when they are engaging, and they are only engaging when they aren't wasting time. If a story is worthless if it is never read, then that should show just how critical tight dialogue is. Alright, so you've written your dialogue and it's pretty good, but as you read your story draft, something still feels off about it. Well, the likely reason is that the story paused for the dialogue. Let's talk about fixing that now. Generally speaking, you don't have to have situations where dialogue goes on for an entire section of the page with nothing else happening. It can be easy to find yourself in that situation if, say, you have two characters talking while they sit opposite each other at a table, sitting beside each other on a bus, or another scene where the characters are just waiting for something. After all, you probably already set up everything in the scene, and now the conversation is the only thing that isn't already finished in the description. The good news is, this is a relatively simple thing to fix. First, allow the world to still be an active participant during the scene through the use of minor breaks. If they are at a restaurant, have the waiter bring the plates to them in the middle of a line. If they are on the bus, have them go over a pothole or stop at a random station so people can get on and off in the background. For really heavy conversations, you can follow the eyes of the protagonist. One example of that is an old Ernest Hemingway story called Soldier's Home. Notice how this line is not only able to break up a rather large monologue by Krebs' mother, but also give Krebs something to do and even add another carnal detail to the scene. It's a simple practice, but it works. In fact, in a very famous short story by Raymond Carver called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, the entire story is constructed using such moments. It's a single scene story that takes place with the entire cast of characters sitting around a table. But the story works because Carver makes sure that the dialogue is consistently tight, and that the characters are always busy with their hands. Usually it's passing around a gin bottle and pouring it into various glasses. The point is, even confined to a single table, the characters are still doing things during the conversation. Otherwise, the entire story would just be a wall of dialogue, and let's just say the story would not be nearly as respected as it is if it were written in that way. The PDF of the story is free online, by the way, and I recommend giving it a read so you can see just how effective the structure works. Of course, something to remember is that these dialogue breaks work best when they are tailored to the character making them. I mean, yeah, generic ones will do the job, but finding the ones that really help solidify your character's personality, mood, and position in the story, and relationship to the other characters in the scene can make all the difference. If your character is a skilled assassin, you can make sure the scene involves them cleaning their gun, or knife, or whatever. If your character is on a date, the other person cooked, and doesn't want to hurt their feelings about not liking it, they can maybe busy themselves with pouring drinks, buttering bread, rearranging the plate, and so on while looking for an opportunity to secretly dispose of the food. Breaking up long sections of dialogue improves the story, but if you can also further develop the character's world and plot while you do so, your story is going to be far better than you might have even imagined it. While adding those breaks does increase the word count, which might seem counterintuitive to the earlier points in this video, it's only because the earlier points are supposed to make room for the dialogue breaks. Writers have been using these tools for decades. In short, dialogue and character interactions are the real meat and potatoes for a lot of stories. Yet, it can be easy to get bogged down with focusing on everything else, especially in earlier drafts, so it can often feel lackluster or even in the way of the story. The good news is, as long as you stay rooted in your subtext, allow the world to remain involved, and ensure your dialogue is tight and serves the story, your story will be well on the way to flourishing. The next Saturday video is about scene construction. Keep writing.